The Victoria and Albert Museum and the British Museum will return some 30 gold and silver artifacts to Ghana on a long-term loan agreement. The items were taken from the Asante people by the British during the 19th century colonization era. Founding director of the Khotso Seatlholo Institute and African scholar Tharollo Seatlholo joins us for more on this. Tharollo, thank you so much for joining us on this conversation. So the museums are calling it an important cultural exchange, an important cultural collaboration. What do you make of this arrangement?
Okay, so sorry. Hi, Masa. It's just that this is also so overwhelming as news, and the question that we should ask ourselves is important to who? Which countries is this important to? Because if we think about this agreement between the Asante king and the British, or rather the neo-colonial British system, we will remember that these gold artifacts were taken from the Asante court. So this indicates a greater truth of the Asante king, of why is he not honoring African justice systems? Why is not honoring African culture? So who is this important to? Especially if we think about the principles of the British, that they say it's a gesture for humanity, equality, humility, but this has not always applied to African cultures, to African countries, because they've always sought to dominate. So in terms of this agreement, who is it beneficial to? And if it was not for the agreement of the Asante king, then we would not be having this conversation. We'd rather be happy that he denied this loan and sought reparations and sought for justice of all gold artifacts of the Asante nation, and also even in terms of the entire Ghana, the artifacts, and also of the African continent. But this is not a case. He agrees to the loan. Who is he pleasing? What about the royalty? What about the spirits that actually empower him? So it's also quite disempowering to see that he's not standing up for his nation, his African culture, and who exactly is he representing? And that should tell us that this is more important to who than who, because there are power dynamics.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question, because who will this benefit? Because out of these somewhat 30 artifacts that are said to be loaned, which is also still ironic, because how do you loan something that doesn't rightfully belong to you in the first place? Out of these 30, it's a drop in the ocean. There's some 239 items in British museums and, also all over the world that aren't being returned to their rightful owners.
So, we have to also think about Benin. Also, why are some artifacts being returned and others aren't? And here we're speaking about gold. And knowing Britain as a historic imperial power, when an African country enters into an agreement with it, or any sort of partnership post-colonialism, it's just an indication of it being a neo-colony, or this partnership will be basically neo-colonial, simply because a cooperation or partnership between two unequal powers is not practical. This agreement is an entire erasure of African justice and is not based on truth. So who exactly is it benefiting, especially if it's so minimal? They tell us that, okay, this is a loan and you can't return this based on the British laws. You can't return it. But whose artifacts are they? What was done? And by the Asante king actually agreeing to this, he's basically implying that he accepts that he was conquered, or they were conquered in the unjust wars of colonization, but he seeks to perpetuate it. And what does it say to Queen Asintawa, who fought against the famous British laws? What does it say to the entire royalty and the spirits also endowed in the art? So it's just an entire dismissal and a maintenance of the neo-colonial British system. So yeah.
Do you think they probably should have leveraged off the power of the underdog? When we look at South Africa taking Israel to ICJ, when we look at small rights groups as well in the likes of the US and the UK, taking action against their leaders as well for what's going on in Gaza. There seems to be this geopolitical shift internationally. Do you think that this was the time that they could have actually had a proper negotiation and not one about collaboration, but rather, returning?
I mean, they could. I'm not sure if they would succeed, especially if we look at British history, also in interaction with African countries, where the British have always had a form of power over indirect rule, right? So they take particular kings or particular African leaders, and in exchange for material gain, they basically make the African leaders pass laws that are anti-African in terms of their own benefits. So it's also interesting when we look at indirect rule, even here in South Africa. This is how it works, and this is not really representative of the people. So to answer your question, I'm not too sure about that, simply because the Asante King might have been making this decision on his own personal capacity. And we must remember that he went to the coronation of King Charles. So we don't know if this is entirely personal. And even though the personal is the political, but the political right now is not representative of the people. So we must think, is this for the individual or for the nation, especially if the nation was not consulted in terms of what they want to do about this. So I'm not too sure about that.
You made mention earlier about, British laws. And, when asked about this, a special advisor to Ghana's culture minister said that this deal in particular was a good starting point, considering British laws that prohibit them from returning artifacts to their rightful owners.
Prohibit them after 400 years of colonization. It's quite ambitious to think that this is a start, and a start on a loan, whereas there's so many things that have been done that have to be returned. A start to what? If first it needs to be negotiated, because we first need to agree that this was wrongfully taken. Not only was it wrongfully taken, profits were made out of it. These are from a kingdom that represents military wealth and military power and even wealth. So of course, this is symbolic to Britain in itself in terms of their dominance and conquest. So I don't understand, in terms of the start and the 3-year loan, what else could come out of it, because the beginning is already doomed, simply because we're not agreeing that these were wrongfully taken and they still wish to retain them to themselves. So, yeah.
And also bearing in mind that, these artifacts are only going to be returned by 2 museums in Britain. So this is not a collective stance.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, 2 museums, 30 artifacts. How many are there? How many of other African nations? And again, back to, the Asante King potentially pursuing his individual gain or pursuits. What about of the entire Ghanaian nation? What about the value of the gold? So, I mean, it's really minimal, and to say that this is a start is quite embarrassing. And if anything, it should have considered to return everything, also pay reparations, and then told, or in terms of the European Union, in terms of Europe in itself, also told them or inspired them to return the artifacts to other African countries, since Britain is not the only one holding the artifacts from African people.
Well, so we have come a long way, and it seems we still have a very long way to go before we get all those artifacts back to their rightful place in Africa. Thank you so much for joining us and your insights this morning. That was African scholar Tharollo Seatlholo.